Here we'll draw key features of the brain using a lateral view of the cerebrum. To begin, start a table. Denote that the brain comprises primary cortices or areas, which initiate motor output or are primary cortical sensory reception centers. Association cortices or areas, which process and integrate cortical information. Denote that we divide the lateral surface of the brain into four key anatomic lobes: the frontal lobe anteriorly, the occipital lobe posteriorly, the temporal lobe inferiorly, and the parietal lobe, which borders each lobe. Now draw the lateral surface of the brain. Draw the lobes of the brain as anterior is the frontal lobe, behind it superiorly is the parietal lobe, inferiorly is the temporal lobe, and posteriorly is the occipital lobe. Give the brain some texture. It has a lumpy appearance. Next, let's draw two key sulci, brain invaginations: the sylvian fissure, also referred to as the lateral sulcus, which distinguishes the cerebral lobes, and the central sulcus, which distinguishes the frontal and parietal lobes. Now draw the primary motor cortex in the posterior frontal lobe. Write that it lies within the precentral gyrus, given its location in front of the central sulcus, and that it comprises primary motor neurons and pathways that control skeletal muscle, which is under volitional control, not smooth muscle, which is under autonomic control. Thus, it's often also called the somatic motor area. Somatic implies conscious control. Each hemisphere innervates the opposite side of the body. Then draw the primary sensory cortex in the anterior parietal lobe. Write that it lies within the postcentral gyrus, given its location behind the central sulcus. It receives sensory input from body regions that we consciously perceive. Thus, it's often called the somatic sensory area. Each hemisphere receives sensory input from the opposite side of the body. Now in the posterior occiput, label the primary visual cortex, V1, at the occipital pole. The primary visual cortex is far more prominent on the medial aspect of the brain, which is not shown here. Write that it mostly lies around the calcarine sulcus, which is on the medial surface of the brain. Write that visual stimuli first reach the cortex within the primary visual cortex. Then write that each cerebral hemisphere receives visual input from the opposite visual field. Now let's use visual field maps to show that each eye captures both halves of the visual world, the left visual field being in light pink and the right visual field being in dark pink in our diagram. Next, peel back the superior temporal lobe and along the inner fold label the primary auditory cortex. Write that it lies within the transverse temporal gyri, Heschel's gyri. Write that auditory stimuli first reach the cortex within the primary auditory cortex. Write that each hemisphere receives auditory input from both sides of the world. Now let's transition to the association cortices. In the superior parietal lobe, label the somatosensory association cortex, which interprets and integrates sensory information and is an important sensory planning region. In front of the primary motor area, label the premotor area, which assembles complex motor programs. Next, in front of the premotor area, label the frontal eye fields. Clinically, we assume this area controls volitional eye movements, but in reality, eye movements come from disparate motor areas. Then label the prefrontal cortex in the anterior frontal lobe, which governs three discrete cognitive domains. Laterally is logistical, meaning task sequencing. Use the L as a mnemonic. Inferiorly is impulse control. Use the I. Medially is motivation. Use the M. Now along the anterior sylvian fissure, delineate Broca's area. Start a box for language production and processing. Write that Broca's area is the language output area, and that it lies in the inferior frontal gyrus. As a clinical correlation, write that Broca's aphasia is a non-fluent language disorder. meaning language output is severely impaired but comprehension is mostly preserved. Speech output is hesitant and effortful. Broca's aphasia localizes to Broca's area, but also to many other, mostly motor brain regions. Next, within the posterior superior temporal gyrus, delineate Wernicke's area. Write that it's the language reception area, and that it lies within the superior temporal gyrus posteriorly. As a clinical correlation, write that Wernicke's aphasia is a fluent aphasia, meaning there's preserved speech output but poor comprehension. Speech is melodious but meaningless. Wernicke's aphasia localizes to Wernicke's area and neighboring temporoparietal regions, plus the insula. Next, show that the occipital lobe comprises cortical visual processing. The posterior aspect of the hemispheres are so dedicated to vision that clinicians can easily miss large posterior cerebral strokes if they fail to check the patient's visual fields. Indicate that we subdivide visual processing into the dorsal stream, the where visual pathway, which lies along the superior occipital lobe and parietal lobe and provides visuospatial localization processing, and the ventral stream, the what visual pathway, which lies along the inferior occipital lobe and temporal lobe and provides object recognition processing. Finally, let's learn both the insula and the homunculus. We'll use the motor homunculus here. We'll draw it in coronal section. Draw the frontal lobe, then the temporal lobe. Separate them with a slice of the sylvian fissure. Then draw the insula. Write that it lies beneath the cerebral folds, the opercula. Write that it participates in many varied, mostly subconscious functions: pain modulation, appetite, visceral sensation, anxiety and emotion, socialization, and auditory processing. Now draw the motor homunculus. Write that the motor homunculus is a representation of the topographical distribution of neurons that, through relay neurons, command volitional striated muscle. Write that the sensory homunculus is similar but not the same as the motor homunculus. It contains sensory input from regions not under volitional command, like the genitals and abdomen, in addition to those under volitional command. Start laterally just above the sylvian fissure. Draw the tongue, face, thumb, hand. We'll see that these are enlarged compared to what follows because they require significantly more muscular innervation to produce the movements than the rest of the body. Upper limb, trunk, lower limb, and foot, which ends just above what we'll see as the cingulate gyrus on the medial aspect of the brain. This concludes our diagram.